Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second part of the conversations that I recorded at the end of last week, trying to make sense of what the hell is going on in British politics. You're going to hear from historians Robert Saunders and David Klemperer, from Hannah White from the Institute for Government, and the political scientist Rob Ford. This time, trying to decide what might be coming next. We start with Robert Saunders and the question of whether the two main parties are living on borrowed time. Given this is a system that is designed to focus the voters' minds on a binary choice, and if the voters are tempted to move to the fringes, it tries to pull them back. Its merits were always thought to be that it was relatively clean, in the sense that if there was a government that was increasingly unpopular, the voters would be corralled towards the opposition because they wouldn't want to waste their vote. And yet the local elections seem to indicate a voting public, indeed a nation, in which that logic no longer holds. The most startling fact about the local election results is that 5 parties polled above 16%, and no party polled above 26%. From 16 to 26 is a very narrow band within which to squeeze 5 parties. And that leaves out the 2 parties that actually won in that election, the SNP and Plaid Cymru. The only clear winners, that is, they became parties of government. Reform haven't become a party of government, though they've taken over many councils, were the SNP and Plaid. So this does feel like a political system in which a politics is being squeezed that cannot be accommodated. And yet I have no idea what's going to give here. So one possibility is that the logic reasserts itself and it forces voters to make that choice. In the end, it returns to a binary system. I cannot see that happening. The Conservative Party is actually looking pretty entrenched. Maybe a year ago, you might have thought that we were on the cusp of a switch on the right, and the Conservatives were in terminal decline and Reform would have to become more mainstream and replace them. I cannot see that happening. I cannot see either the Liberal Democrats or the Greens replacing the Labour Party as the choice for voters who don't want a right-wing government. I don't see how this works.
As a historian, I'm always very wary of making predictions about the future. It's not really my specialist area. But I share your skepticism that this system is going to reassert itself. And that's partly because the decline has been going on for much longer than people realise. In 1951, 97% of all voters backed either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. By 2010, so before this more recent period of instability, that had dropped to 65%. If we actually include the growing number of non-voters, the share of the total electorate that backed one of the big two dropped from over 80% in 1951 to about 42% in 2010. So it roughly halves. So actually, voter behaviour has been moving away from the two-party system for a very long time. The electoral system disguised that for a long time. And to some extent, actually, that was a poisoned chalice for the two major parties, because it meant they didn't take the risk seriously. They were still winning very large majorities on smaller and smaller shares of the vote. But there is a point at which first past the post stops being a springboard and becomes a kind of trapdoor that you drop through. And that's particularly important because, to some extent, first past the post relies on a confidence trick. It relies on the electorate believing that it is a waste of time to vote for anybody else. That if you do cast a vote you'd really like for the Greens or UKIP as was, you're actually just wasting your vote. That illusion is now shattered. And what that means is that the squeeze effect has in some ways switched around. Instead of the big parties squeezing the smaller ones, it's now the new parties squeezing the traditional ones. So the Conservative Party is losing votes to Reform on its right and to the Lib Dems on its left. The Labour Party is losing some of its traditional heartlands to Farage East candidates, and it's losing some of its sort of more metropolitan voters to the Greens and to other progressive parties. So first past the post has gone from being the friend of the big two to a kind of axeman. It's very difficult to see how they recover from that.
In that long story that you tell, that the two main parties have been seeing their vote share shrink slowly but steadily, there was this interesting blip, which was 2017. And I do remember around the time of Brexit, people who supported Brexit, serious, well-informed people who supported Brexit, saying one of the effects it will have is to reassert the logic of the British electoral system, because voters have got confused about where power really lies. They're expressing their frustrations with a constitutional arrangement they don't feel they signed up for. Getting out of the EU will restore people's clarity that your vote for the Westminster Parliament is the one that really matters, and it will focus people's minds. And I can remember having conversations with people in 2017 where they said, aha, it's worked. Hasn't worked particularly well for Theresa May, but my God, look at Jeremy Corbyn's vote share. People have decided, I think it was 82%, the two main parties combined. But we can now see that that election was actually the blip. It really does look like an outlier in that much longer story that you tell. And yet, to go back to the point that I made, particularly on the right, I want to ask you whether you think the left can realign, but particularly on the right, it feels like it could remain frozen in this divided state that it exists now for a long time. If either the Conservatives or Reform could get above 30%, and the left remains divided, you probably would see a majority government elected to Westminster with one of the two right-wing parties. Again, I hesitate to make predictions about the future, but the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch look like they have bottomed out. And actually, those Conservative voters have more or less signalled they're not going to Reform under any circumstances. Reform look like they have peaked, to me. And actually, both of them are probably going to be fighting for 40 to 45% of the vote and dividing it up between them. And I don't know how long that can last. Of course, in the background here is my question, can this electoral system survive? I don't know how long that can last.
I actually think I would be slightly more pessimistic about the Conservative Party's prospects than you. I think one of the real puzzles, actually, of the last week, and indeed the last couple of years, is how little the Conservative Party is panicking about its position. The Conservative Party was absolutely mullered in the local elections this year. It came fifth in the Scottish Parliament. It is now the fourth party in the Senate. It was the main opposition party in both those places not very long ago. It is now the fourth party in local government. It lost, I think, about 500 council seats. It lost 6 councils. In the Gordon and Denton by-election last year, it polled 1.9% of the vote. Again, in a party the equivalent of which, before the boundary changes, it was the second party in, as recently as 2019. This is an extraordinary state for a party that is in opposition. And I think you could at least say the Labour Party is panicking, that the Labour Party recognises that something terrible is happening and that it needs to do something about it. The Conservative Party seems to have decided that things are absolutely fine. It's like the Titanic went down and the Belfast shipyards are putting out press releases about how, there are green shoots of recovery in the quality of their catering. I do think the Conservative Party has a real problem here. And it's not very clear what its identity is actually going to be, given that it faces a challenge for, if you like, its kind of radical right vote from Reform and its traditional Southern vote from the Liberal Democrats.
And yet I still cannot see Reform making the switch, doing what the Labour Party did to the Liberal Party in the 1920s, in that I feel there probably is and will remain, not least because people live for longer. The Conservative Party vote is very old and it will cultivate that vote. There seems to be a constituency in Britain, maybe 15, 20%, because if you're still voting Conservative now, I think you're going to carry on voting Conservative, unless the logic of the first past the post system sweeps you up. And if the Conservative Party can poll 18, 19, 20%, I think it is very hard for Reform to form a government. There are versions of the British electoral system in which even on, say, 29% of the vote, Reform can win a majority, but they can't win 29% of the vote if the Conservatives are polling 20%. And I think Kemi Badenoch, you say it's a catastrophe for the Conservatives, it is. Kemi Badenoch is by some distance now the most popular party leader in Britain. So there are two things going on here. And my question remains, if one of these two parties can't see the other one off, at some point, someone's going to have to say this electoral system needs to be changed.
So I think you're right that there is a cohort, maybe it's sort of 15% or so of the electorate that is wedded to the Conservative Party. I think there is a legitimate question about how long that cohort lives. That is a very elderly cohort. It's not going to be around forever. And that is a problem for the Conservative Party. It's not clear that it is recruiting a new electorate to replace, if you like, the kind of natural wastage of the system. But I think it would be a mistake to imagine that the parties that we have now are necessarily going to be the ones that are still dominant in 10 years' time. Another difference from the 1920s is that the change in the party system at that point in time is quite difficult because all three parties actually are quite deeply embedded in social institutions. That to be a liberal is to be connected to things like the nonconformist chapels. And in that sense, a liberal political identity actually remains quite strong, even after the party itself institutionally has collapsed. The Labour Party is built around the trade union movement. The Conservative Party was entrenched in things like the Church of England, the Rotary clubs, voluntary society. So these were actually quite tough plants with quite deep roots. The politics we have now doesn't have that kind of stability. No one knows what happens to reform if Nigel Farage vanishes from the scene. No one knows what happens to the Green Party if something happens to Zach Polanski. The Labour Party doesn't have its roots in the unions in the same way that it used to. The Conservative Party doesn't have that Tory social world. So it may be that there are more political changes to happen in the next few years. The parties contesting a kind of 2039 election might be different again to the ones that we're looking at now.
On the left, in a nation where there is still a pretty clear left-right divide, you're either, on the whole, a Reform Conservative voter or you're a Lib Dem, SNP, Plaid, Labour, Green voter, and those two blocks are relatively evenly matched, though there's probably a little bit more room on the upside on the left than there is on the right at the moment anyway. Again, I cannot see the Green Party replacing the Labour Party. I cannot see the Liberal Democrats replacing the Labour Party. The Green Party, to my mind, is now essentially a Corbynite party. And Jeremy Corbyn can come very close to being Prime Minister if he's leader of the Labour Party. Zach Polanski could probably come quite close to being Prime Minister if he was leader of the Labour Party. But as leader of the Green Party, again, I can't see his ceiling being much higher than 25%. And it also looks frozen. And again, I don't see what's going to give there. They all hate each other. That's the other problem as well. The real animosity in this kind of politics is between the parties on either side of the fundamental divide. Greens hate Labour people and Labour people hate Greens much more than either of them hate the Tories these days, I think. What happens on the left? People talk about alliances, electoral pacts. They talk about the voters working out in their individual constituencies who has the best chance of keeping reform out. But it's not a stable basis for politics or for government.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the emergence of a kind of bloc politics in which we may shift between parties, but we have a sense of whether we're part of the left bloc or the right bloc. But as you say, that is troubled by the fact that the things these blocs disagree on internally really, really matter to them. It's not just personal animosities either. It is questions like Gaza, immigration, Britain's relations with the European Union. These are really important questions on which it is actually quite difficult to compromise. I think we're not going to get back to a world in which single parties are winning 45% of the vote. And that's partly because the culture of those parties has changed so dramatically. If you're going to be a party of 45% of the vote, you have to be a broad tent. You have to have a Labour Party that actually holds within it people like Jeremy Corbyn and Zach Polanski. You have to have a Conservative Party that contains within it Nigel Farage and David Gauke. And it's a long time since that's been the case. I think the two main parties made a rod for their own backs here by actively shrinking their own constituency. A Labour Party that doesn't have room for Diane Abbott and a Conservative Party that doesn't have room for David Gauke is not going to be a party that wins 40+% of the vote.
Do you think the psychology of politics and indeed of government could change? So I'm assuming Andy Burnham has said that were he to become Prime Minister, his platform includes reform of the electoral system. This is within the bounds of possibility. It's probably closer to being within the bounds of possibility than at any point in recent political history. And yet people talk about it, but the electoral system seems to remain in place, not least because the incentives for people to have just one more go on the hope that they might win a majority. Keir Starmer has shown you can win a majority on a very small share of the vote. And yet, winning these kinds of majorities on these vote shares in this kind of political environment, and we haven't even talked about the international backdrop, the economic conditions, the precarity of the British economy more broadly, the energy crisis. Winning these kinds of majorities on these vote shares in these kinds of conditions is almost by definition a recipe for instability. Keir Starmer was talking about what he would do over his 10 years, and it seems laughable for a Prime Minister to talk like that, even though once upon a time that is what he should have been thinking with a majority of this size. That the psychology of government, say Nigel Farage was to squeak in with a majority on a very small vote share, is that you just have to more or less get it all done in 6 months because it's going to fall apart. And that you could get a British politics that becomes radically more unstable than it is now, partly because governments feel like they're operating against a very, very tight clock, becomes almost a kind of frantic version of executive politics in which you try to make your mark on the assumption you're not going to be around for long.
Well, it's also possible that we then move back to an older model of politics in which people assume that they might move in and out of government across time, which is again where we are in the 1920s, that Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin can, in a sense, alternate in government over a long period of time. We've got used to a period in which prime ministers have one chunk in office and then their career is over. That might not be where we're at in the future. And on the point about electoral reform, I think it's true to say that there is actually an appetite for electoral reform in traditional wings of British politics that used to be hostile to it that is entirely new. But I don't think that we should overrate the obstacles here. Firstly, the next general election will almost certainly happen under first past the post, because it is almost certainly now too late to change the electoral system for 2029. If you were going to have some proportional system, even if you could get it through Parliament in a single session, even if you didn't have a referendum or go down that kind of ground, you would then have to entirely redraw the constituency system. You would have to have a boundary commission. You would have to set up a new electoral map. And it's very unclear to me that that could be done before 2029. So whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, I think the next election is going to be a first past the post election. So then the question is, does the next Parliament do something about the electoral system? There may well be an appetite for that, but we can all say we believe in electoral reform. Once you ask us which system do we want to replace it, actually that support entirely splinters. We might be against first past the post, but do we want a system that is proportional? Do we want a system that is preferential? What kind of regional relationship do we want to the system? These are questions on which actually British politics has done very little thinking. And we saw this with Brexit. It was very easy to say that you were for Brexit or against Brexit. The question of what kind of Brexit you wanted or what kind of future relationship you wanted absolutely broke those coalitions apart. And that's a question we haven't even begun thinking about in relation to electoral politics.
Just as it's easier to say I don't like this Prime Minister than it is to say which Prime Minister I would like him to be replaced by. That's a good one to end on, because whatever's happened in a week's time, that statement will still be true. So I don't think there were too many hostages to fortune in that. You and I have talked about proportional representation on this podcast. We haven't seen it laid out yet, but my understanding is that part of Andy Burnham's pitch to be something different is that he will push an electoral reform agenda, which would be transformative. Whatever else happens would be transformative for British politics. Do you think it's viable in the sense, do you think an Andy Burnham premiership could command the support in the Commons to get that through, get it through before the next election, or maybe couldn't be done before the next election, in which case, what happens? But then, more broadly, what happens to British politics if we do move to any kind of proportional system, given how much of what we've seen to this point can only be understood through the dynamics of the first past the post system?
So, in terms of whether we'll actually get PR in the world where Andy Burnham is Prime Minister, I think it depends on the kind of politician Andy Burnham turns out to be. And I think there's a kind of interesting irony here, which is Andy Burnham wants to have proportional representation, says he supports proportional representation because he presents himself as a particular kind of politician, a politician who is consensual, who reaches out across party lines, who engages in sincere dialogue, who doesn't force things, who enables things to happen through conversation, discussion, and consensus. That's how he presents his success in Manchester. And he argues that we want to have proportional representation in Westminster because that will create that kind of politics at the national level. Now, the irony is that for Andy Burnham to actually get PR, it would require him being a very different sort of politician, a politician who is willing to stare down a lot of Labour MPs and go, you know what, I don't care what you think. I don't care that you hate this. We're doing this. I'm leader. We're having it my way. I think that if he has the steel to do that and is willing to not always be consensual, not always to engage in a discussion, and sometimes just to do things because he really believes in them and is willing to impose them, then I think we could get PR. But I think it will really depend on how Andy Burnham approaches this. If he tries to build a consensus in the Labour Party to keep everyone on board, to keep everyone happy, I think PR would end up getting pushed into the long grass. It would turn into a manifesto commitment to the next election rather than something that would happen now.
And before I get you to say what you think it would do to British politics, the traditional fate of bold constitutional ambitions is that in office, prime ministers and governments have more pressing matters to deal with. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether Andy Burnham is going to be the next prime minister. Say he does become the prime minister this summer, it's almost certain that the following 6 months will be dominated by the possibility and maybe even the reality of economic crisis. Traditionally, at that point, constitutional matters get put to the sidelines. So it seems to me that's the other question about the kind of politician he is. If he is a traditional kind of politician, and my guess is you don't know until you've moved into Downing Street how you're going to react under these conditions. But for instance, a financial crisis, a crisis in the bond markets, to still say that constitutional reform is something that it is worth sacrificing political capital for would, let's say, be unusual in the politics of recent times.
I think that's right. I think what we'd have to consider, though, is the way in which I think Burnham sees this and the kind of arguments Burnham is drawing on. And I think it's clear that we're going to go through a very painful cost of living squeeze as a result of the war in Iran. And the question is how Labour responds to that. And I think that the bit of the party around Burnham believes that Labour needs to make an argument that links economics with power and basically says people need to have more control over their lives. And that is about economic security, but it's also about changing the political settlement. And the argument I think they would make is that changing politics will have an impact on economics. Ultimately, it's a kind of left-wing version of the Brexit argument. The Brexit argument was, we'll do this big constitutional reform, you take back control, and that will empower you in your own life in a day-to-day way. And I think since 2016, a lot of the left has been looking for its version of that. And I think Andy Burnham thinks that constitutional reform can be that, and that he will make a big offer about electoral reform, devolution, more powers for mayors, a more participatory kind of politics, and that is what will give people a sense that a new settlement is being built, one in which not only they'll have more power, but in which they will ultimately have more control over the economic forces that shape their lives. So I think that would be the kind of way in which Burnham would try and sell constitutional reform in the current context, and the argument that I think he and his supporters would be making within the Labour Party about why this was something worth focusing on.
Robert Saunders, when we spoke to him, said that whatever happens, he thinks the parliamentary timetable might just be too tight to get PR through this parliament. But I'm going to lay that to one side and ask you, were it to happen, lots of ifs on the way to that, lots of ifs, were it to happen, do you think it would, to start with anyway, freeze in place the kind of multi-party divisions that we have in British politics at the moment? 5 parties, 6 parties, 7 parties. The electorate already seems to have done a certain amount of self-sorting into these smaller groupings where the ceiling seems to be 30% for any of them. We just had local elections in which 5 parties got more than 16%, incredibly, which feels like a proportional representation outcome. Do you think it would cement what we've already seen, or do you think the shake-up actually would then begin? There would be a new sorting when people understood the new rules of the system and started to think about how they wanted to distribute their votes.
Well, the very boring answer here is that I think a lot depends on the precise kind of electoral system you use.
Oh, I love that answer. I love that kind of answer.
I think that there are proportional systems that are very, very open to new entrants, where I think we could see a huge amount of fragmentation really quite quickly.
So much more fragmentation than we've got already.
Yes, if we use certain, the Dutch electoral system, you can get seats on about, I think it's like 0.75% of the vote. If we use that system, I think we'd see all sorts of small new parties emerging. If we use something close to what they use in Wales or Scotland, I think we would be more likely to see, at least for now, a kind of cementing of the current party system. But I think the really interesting thing that would happen is it would change the way in which parties compete, because suddenly it would no longer be so geographically based. And if you're the Liberal Democrats, right now, the sensible thing to do is to focus on the specific set of seats where you're a viable party. And it doesn't matter if you get 10% of the vote in some other bit of the country because you're not winning any seats. But under a proportional system, the incentives to have this very specific geographical focus, I think, will really change. So I think the way in which the parties engage geographically and engage with each other would have to change significantly. And I think there'd be this question, and I think, Burnham, I think, is a progressive alliance politician, or at least is presenting himself as such. And that requires Labour changing its attitude to the Greens quite radically. Probably also the Greens changing their attitude to Labour quite radically. And I think we are in this world where the electorate is doing bloc politics. The electorate, I think, understands that there are really two sides here. There's the left side and the right side. And the left side is Labour, Greens, Liberal Democrats. And the right side is the Conservatives and Reform. Politicians, though, I think are very, very much trying to resist that idea in how they talk about things. And I think proportional representation might force them to acknowledge that. And I think that would lead to a very different way in which the parties compete. Simultaneously, they'd be competing in many more places. Labour and the Liberal Democrats at the moment don't really compete directly pretty much anywhere. Under a proportional system, they would be competing directly everywhere. But I think it would also be a more amicable kind of competition because the parties would know that there'd be a coalition at the end of it. And the question is it a left coalition or a right coalition? And that means that as much as the progressive parties would be competing more and the conservative parties would be competing more, they would know that there's some limits to how hard they're going to go against each other.
I want to finish with some international comparisons, but it relates to what we've just been talking about. If I was a Labour MP, one anxiety I might have about a proportional system is within that system, the party it's sometimes hardest to imagine having a very clear basis is the Labour Party. The Labour Party could be squeezed, especially in this expressive era that you talk about. A lot of commentary in recent weeks has been asking, what is the Labour Party for? And it's not that easy to answer it if it's not a big tent party. If it's not a big tent party, then it shrinks to something very little. And something else that's featured a lot in the commentary is to ask the question, is Labour on a trajectory that is comparable to what happened to the socialists in France or the SPD in Germany, less dramatic? Is Keir Starmer François Hollande? Is Keir Starmer Olaf Scholz? On the other side, you have people saying, look at Canada, look at Australia, look at Albanese, look at Mark Carney, and look at what a tough and politically shrewd leader of a centre-left party can do. But of course, this isn't just Australia, Canada, and Europe. This isn't just the English-speaking world and the continental European world. This is also about electoral systems. So where do you think the international comparison is for where Labour finds itself at the moment? For instance, let me start by saying to you, do you think Keir Starmer could turn out to be the Labour Party's Hollande?
Well, I wrote an article for the New Statesman in June 2023, warning that if Labour wasn't careful, that Keir Starmer could end up being the British François Hollande. And I think since I've written that article, I've been really quite depressed by how much I think the warnings of that article have proven right. And I think part of it is I think Keir Starmer and François Hollande are quite similar politicians in a lot of ways. Hollande was a party manager. He was someone whose job was smoothing down differences in the Socialist Party. And that meant he wasn't very good at being a president, someone who had to really lead. And I think in the same way, Starmer is a very effective public sector manager, but I don't think he's someone who can very effectively lead. But I do think that the Hollande comparison is probably the best one because it is that situation of a centre-left party that was in opposition for many years, coming into power and basically failing to satisfy its electorate quite quickly and suddenly facing competition from new parties within its section of the electorate. I think it's still salvageable. I think that Andy Burnham could end up being the British Mark Carney. But I think that Labour's current trajectory is that of European social democratic parties that struggled in office and were faced with a political environment that their kind of long-term institutional basis of support had fallen away, and then they struggled in office, and then they began to sink down. And I think that you are absolutely right that a problem social democratic parties in Europe have had is once they cease to be the largest party on the left, once they cease to be the default left-wing party that is the big tent party, it becomes very unclear what they're for. And I think we saw this in the most recent French presidential election, where if you went through the different left-wing candidates, it was very clear what each of them was for. The Communist Party was the stalwart defender of public services and traditional working class interests. The Green Party was about the environment. Macron was the kind of centrist progressive option. And Mélenchon was the radical, smash everything up, leave the EU, anti-system left-wing option. And it was very unclear what the Socialist Party was for in that. It had elements of all of those different parties in its program because historically it had been the big tent party that would almost federate the left. And when it ceases to play that role, it becomes very unclear what the distinct offering of social democracy is. And I think that if Labour falls to a position where it is not clearly stronger than the Lib Dems or the Greens, and it currently does seem to be falling into that position, it risks suffering exactly that fate.
Could it be the party, I don't know if this would be true under Burnham or anyone else, but could it be the party of the public sector worker, which is, it is its voter base still, with all of the fragmentation that's going on. And that's going to remain a significant base in British politics, not least because public sector employment is still going to be a significant part of the employment landscape. It would no longer be a big tent party because it's never going to be enough. But even where you see the Liberal Democrats and the Greens fighting for this space, is that a possible future? It's not a particularly glorious or indeed a future which suggests much power, but is that the niche that it might find itself falling back into?
So I think that could well be the niche that Labour finds itself falling back into as a party that defends the interests of public sector workers. I think its links with trade unions and specifically public sector trade unions makes that very possible on a kind of institutional level. But I suppose more optimistically, I would like to think that Labour's future is not as the party just of public sector workers, but of almost the idea of the public in general, and that Labour is the party of the public sphere and is the party of public services, but not just public service workers or public service users, but that also defends the public sphere more broadly in terms of defending democracy and democratic institutions, and also a kind of economy that is organised in a public way rather than a private way. I think we're seeing a big rise of private capitalism. Will Hutton has called it the privatization of capitalism. And I think almost the way in which traditional business is moving towards Labour often speaks to this kind of emerging public-private divide, which goes beyond just public sector workers. But I think Labour could end up being the party of one side of that.
Do you think this is the first time, perhaps in post-war British political history, where that vision that you've just laid out, or the possibility of that vision, on the one hand, people might hear it and think it sounds a little like the kind of thing that politicians often say: we're the party of the public, we're the party of the public services, we're the party of the NHS. For goodness sake, Labour politicians have been saying that forever. But that the missing ingredient in that, in a world in which technology is going to continue to reshape our lives in 100 different ways, the missing ingredient in that is a new kind of understanding of democracy. That actually the thing that gives that teeth is not saying we will defend the NHS till the day we die, but for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, saying we are actually going to change the way that politics works, and we are actually going to give you more power, not just more low-level power over the way your public services work in ways that tend to frustrate people more than they empower them, but actual political power. And I think this is probably the first time in my lifetime where that does feel like it is not bound to happen, but a realistic prospect.
I think that's basically right. I think one way in which I understand politics at the moment is I think we're seeing an assault on the public sphere from new forms of private power. And part of that is economic, part of that is technological, part of that is political in the kinds of political programs that are being promoted by Trump, by right-wing populist parties, which I would see as largely about privatizing power in different ways, breaking up the traditional state to enable companies, individuals to exercise new forms of power. And I would say that the role of social democracy in the future is to be the defender of the public sphere and public power. And that means giving individuals more power at the local level, but it also means making sure that the big technological changes that are coming are governed by the public in the public interest.
We don't know what's going to happen, but I want to speculate about an Andy Burnham prime ministership. He has said in his statement, which in itself is slightly weird because it's a statement to the electors of Makerfield, and yet it's a prospectus for the country, that he wants to bring the kind of delivery that he has been able to achieve, he claims, in Manchester, to Westminster. So there is behind that a claim that you can translate the kind of politics that he thinks he has pioneered as the mayor of a metropolitan authority to national government. And I want to know whether you think that that is a plausible ambition.
I'd start by saying I think it's certainly better to go into being Prime Minister, if that is indeed what Andy Burnham manages to achieve, having run something. And having run something like an MCA is even better than having run, various other things you could have run. So we often see people coming into these roles without having had significant leadership responsibility, certainly across different ministerial roles. So that is good. In terms of the specifics, I mean, some of the things you have to do to be a successful mayor, I think, are transferable. I think, you have to be able to bring together the leaders of different local authorities. You have to build coalitions. To be successful, you do have to bring in the private sector, academia, your universities, and so on, and bring people together behind your agenda. And that is certainly something which is needed in the centre of government. It's a whole different scale of task at the centre of government, but it is what the mission approach that Labour said that they were going to take was intended to kind of do. So if you can demonstrate the skill to bring people together in pursuit of an agenda, which I think there's some evidence he's done in Manchester, that is a skill. But I think obviously the thing to note about Andy Burnham is that, he's come in at the end of a long line of people who were establishing Manchester as a successful enterprise well before he arrived. So he has stood on the shoulders of those people who have come before him. But he has managed to establish a strong reputation, in contrast with many local MPs who I think that they have a strong sort of personal mandate in their local area. I think he genuinely does. There's evidence that people see him and him as the mayor and value him and his leadership role. So those sorts of things are things that he might be able to transfer across to a prime ministerial role. But as I say, it is a whole different ball game, and I think that sort of ability to bring together the different wings of the party is going to be absolutely crucial to the success of either Starmer if he goes on, or Burnham if he comes in, or somebody else, because at the moment that is really holding back the ability of the Labour government to get a coherent agenda through.
Were he to make it to number 10, it would be a unique journey in modern, or at least relatively recent British political history, in the sense, having been in central government, having been a minister, but then moving out into a devolved role and then moving back. And we are meant to believe that part of his agenda is to go much further in devolution, that he has an idea of a more devolved form of government. He may also change the electoral system. And yet at the same time, given what we've been discussing, the other thing that's needed is central grip. If this is going to be a success, there may be a vision of a more devolved political system, but it has to go along with getting a grip at the centre. Do you think those two things are consistent? Do you think they could be achieved simultaneously if he has the political skills?
I think they absolutely are compatible. I mean, the other example of this having happened, I guess, is Boris Johnson, isn't it? Going to be London mayor and then coming back.
Yes, so I suppose the difference is what Boris Johnson did not have was executive ministerial experience before he made that journey. But of course, you're right. That shows how short historical memories are. In my mind, I was thinking back to the 19th century or Joseph Chamberlain and had forgotten about Boris. Thank you.
I think the two things could be compatible, because one of the problems we have is, as you say, there is a lack of grip at the centre, but partly that is because the centre tries to do too much. And so it fails to prioritise, and delivery, which is all driven by the centre, I think is pretty universally acknowledged. That's not always the best way to do things. You don't know what's going on in local areas, and you need variety and you need direction to come. from closer to the right geography for what it is that you're trying to do. So I think it is completely compatible to say you're going to go further, faster with devolution. And I think it could be really good for the agenda of devolution within the country to have someone who has made that journey that Burnham would make from the centre to running an MCA and then back into into actually the role of being Prime Minister. I think one of the best things it would do for that agenda is it would make really good people think that running MCAs was a really good thing to do potentially for their political career and prospects, because we need good people in the system to make it work as well as it can possibly do. And there's lots of other thinking we need to do about how to make devolution work and build its capability and the right systems and accountabilities and all these sorts of things. But I do think it would be very positive for that to have someone as Prime Minister who has genuinely worked at that level, seen what the frustrations are and seen what it takes to make it succeed in one of the MCAs which is furthest on in its journey.
The traditional fate of constitutional reform is that politicians who come into office with a serious commitment to it discover that in office there are more pressing matters to address. And I think we have to assume if Starmer's premiership comes to an end this summer, whoever replaces him will face 6 months or a year of pretty acute financial and economic challenges. Is the system geared up for a Prime Minister who does have a serious commitment to constitutional reform to allow that to go ahead? I have my doubts as to whether even the toughest politician under these conditions could remain committed to something that doesn't seem a priority when the bond markets are screaming blue murder.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that a lot of politicians contemplating the prospect of being in these sorts of roles think they are going to end up doing things which actually are very far from how they end up spending their time. And I'm sure that Starmer would, and most prime ministers indeed would say that about the sort of foreign policy agenda. And that has been very true for Keir Starmer. And I think he's probably quite enjoyed it as well, but that has absorbed a lot of his time. I think the thing about the building of the sort of mayoral system is that it has benefited from a degree of political consensus. It was pushed by Michael Gove, well, originally by George Osborne, then by Michael Gove, and Labour in many ways picked up that agenda and pushed it on. I think, therefore, that is sort of in train, although there's lots of difficulties, I think, for the next sort of phase, because the big metropolitan areas where it's obvious to have a mayor have been done, and the other geographies are harder to roll out to. But I do think you're right that it's going to be a bumpy period for an incoming Prime Minister, and maintaining your sense of priority is just one of the key leadership skills that a Prime Minister needs to have, is that sense of, not getting drowned in the noise and maintaining those priorities. But if a priority is a constitutional one where you don't think what you're going to be able to do is turn around to the voters in a couple of years and say, don't worry that your bills have risen and you can't get a GP appointment, we've got mayoralties, it doesn't feel like such a priority, as you say.
Or indeed, we're about to offer you proportional representation, so just be patient.
No, I mean, I do think on proportional representation, I think before the last election, I found it really hard to see the path to it happening. But I think that a really messy outcome from the next election, and we're already seeing a series of by-elections and local elections where it is clear that first past the post is really creaking because voters are having to work out how to vote tactically to get the outcome they want, and may end up seeing some really weird outcomes with people in charge on very small proportions of the vote. I do think that the sort of a messy outcome from the next election and the one after that could be the route to this feeling like something that politicians do have to promise that they will deliver, because otherwise public confidence in the electoral system and therefore in government is just going to continue to decline.
So that leads into a question which I know you get asked a lot, given the job you have, and it's become the cliched question of the day. People see the number of prime ministers that we've had over the last decade and they ask whether Britain is becoming ungovernable. It's the sort of question the New York Times, newspapers like that, like to ask as often as they can. I think you're going to answer no, but I'd like to know how you back up your no.
So you're right. I get a bit frustrated by this question, partly because I just think it's a bit of a cop-out. It's really tempting for any politician to think that the circumstances in which they're governing are uniquely difficult and they must have uniquely inadequate institutions and flawed people around them. And so it's more difficult than anyone has had it before. And I think if you look back through history, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts, David, on things we should compare the current moment to, it is patently not true that this is an ungovernable country. It's just that the people who've been in charge of it haven't governed it very well in recent years. There have been a lot of challenges, and there've both been shocks and there are negative secular trends which are presenting new policy challenges. But I think that we have institutions, we have processes, we have culture, which all add up to a country which is perfectly capable of being governed. But we do have to think about whether those institutions and rules and so on are the right rules, whether they're fit for purpose, and we have to put the hard work into making them fit for purpose, understanding them, operating them as they are now rather than as we wish them to be, and relying on how they used to work in the past and assuming that that is good enough. So, yeah, I would say, of course, this is a governable country, but we need people who are capable, have the right leadership skills to govern it. But tell me where you think the closest or least close comparisons are that we should bear in mind when people ask this question.
Well, I think that the signal that people are looking for is rapid rotation of prime ministers. There have been comparable periods in these conversations that we've been having for these episodes. People have raised the 1920s, but I don't think turnover of prime ministers is the only measure of this. And even relative to the first half of the 1920s, the first half of the 19-teens, the 4 years before the First World War, is probably as close as Britain has been to being ungovernable since, I don't know, the Chartists or something. Genuinely possibility of civil war in Ireland, and a governing class that was telling its supporters to take up arms against the state in defence of Ulster. Really serious constitutional crises. The crisis with the House of Lords in that period puts the kinds of tensions within the British system today to shame. But a single prime minister, Asquith, was in charge through this, and Lloyd George, the central figure, was in the Treasury. But my God, the country came close to not being able to maintain the rule of law, which is one of the tests. And I don't think we're anywhere near that now. We talked before on this podcast about the possibility of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. That conversation, which seems like a lifetime ago, but in current politics last week seems like a lifetime ago. You said that you were consistently surprised when you thought reform had reached a ceiling, that they went beyond it. And on it went up 20, 22, 25, 28, 30, just above 30. It's now come down a bit. So I hesitate to ask this, but whether you now think the ceiling has been reached. But the other thing I do remember you saying is the next election is a long way off. And the thing about a party like this is that scandal is always just round the corner. One question is what kind of scandals will stick. But one of the remarkable features of this week, there's been so much going on, is that the story about Farage's £5 million gift from a Thai cryptocurrency billionaire, as he's usually described, is rumbling away. And you can feel journalists itching to get a bit of time off so they can really dig their teeth into it. And it's not yet clear when and if it might cut through. But do you think, relative to our earlier conversation, we are closer both to knowing where the ceiling is and to getting a sense of how scandal might come to bite?
Yes, I do, David. I do. I think it was about autumn last year. It was definitely after last year's local elections, because I remember I referenced them. And I said that what Reform achieved last May is they turned first past the post from a sandbag to a springboard. They were able to win these county councils on 2/3 majorities backed by 30% of the vote, time and time again, all the way across the spine of England, as it were. And this was a very different test this year. This was a lot of urban England. It was a lot of London. So the exam question wasn't, can you make first past the post your friend in any conditions? It was like, how broad can you spread it? How deep outside of the sort of hard leave heartlands does your appeal actually go? And they did less well on that exam question, it is fair to say. The broadcasters' projections on their overall vote share were lower. But I think equally crucially, if you dig into the council by council data and you look at some of these places that are kind of like the classic battlegrounds of elections for decades gone past, Swindon, Bexley, well, Bexley's more like core Tories. We'll come on to that in a different way. But basically places that swing backwards and forwards. If you want a majority in Westminster, you've got to win in these places. And they're more socially mixed. That's why they're battlegrounds in the first place. So they're not 65% Leave, they're like 52% Leave. They're right in the median of the electorate. Reform don't do as well in them. And they fall short enough that they don't consistently win seats hand over fist, even though the opposition is fragmented. And so they now sit in what I would call a kind of corridor of uncertainty. They're probably strong enough to be the biggest party in Westminster with performances like this, but they don't look strong enough to have a majority necessarily. And if they slip just a little bit, then you go quite quickly. That's the disproportional, non-linear nature of first past the post. They could go quite quickly from 250 seats to 125 seats with just a few percentage points lost. And that's where I segue into your point about scandal, because that's where I think the scandal thing is really important. For the kind of core true believer Farage electorate, I think it's water off a duck's back. They just don't care. He's their guy. We see it with populist politicians everywhere. Scandal dogs them for ages. And with their core electorate, it's very, very hard to make that breakthrough. Although one optimistic side note on that was, look what happened with Orban. Eventually, the scandals caught up, and even his core vote no longer stuck with him. They deserted him. So no one is completely Teflon.
Yeah, but it did take 3 decades.
Yeah, it took a while. Yeah. So maybe we don't want to wait 3 decades. But scandal's not going to hit like the core true believer reform vote. But reform to get a Westminster majority, or even to be dominant in a minority scenario, they need to move beyond that core. They need to get the marginal voter who likes some of what they're saying, who's really angry with the status quo, but for whom 5 million quid from a crypto billionaire is a question that starts raising some questions for them. They're people who you can't just wave away doubts with this kind of voter. And I do wonder if those two things, we're seeing them kind of coinciding, because we've also seen in the opinion polling two trends that I think are really worth watching that have both happened since we spoke last autumn. The first is that Reform peaked and started falling back quite a lot. They're down about 5 points now in the averages from their peak. And the share of voters who say the party that they most want to stop, the party they're most determined to vote against, is Reform, that share has gone up a lot. And that points to the challenge that Reform have in terms of people coordinating to stop them. So they really can't afford to look dodgy and scandal prone or incompetent to those more moderate voters who are just on the edge, who are flirting with the idea of a reform government. They want change. They're deeply frustrated, but this stuff could be enough. If the stink is strong enough, it could be enough to put them off. So I have a lot more question marks attached to my thinking about reform now than perhaps I did last autumn.
Do you think there's any possibility that there could be a reversal on the right? Badenoch has stemmed the bleeding for the Conservatives. They're in a very weak position, but she is the most popular party leader at the moment. It's not a particularly demanding contest. But something more like an implosion with reform, like you say, there's going to be a core. It would take probably decades for that to feed through. But do you think there's any chance that the logic that we've been talking about, the logic of first past the post, could put the Conservatives back in the game as a possible party of government?
I think never say never, given what we've seen in the past decade. I think it's a fool that projects forward any sort of current situation for any time at all. The polling trend lines are just a roller coaster ride at the moment. I mean, you're right. One of the striking things in the polling right now is that Kemi Badenoch polls well ahead of her party. But that's not yet translated into many votes. I mean, what we did see, and that's why I mentioned Bexley and then dropped it. So I'll bring Bexley back now, having neglected it. Bexley is the kind of place that shows you perhaps the cause for hope in terms of the Conservatives' survival. This is a very, very blue corner of London. Reform were hitting it hard and they fell short. They fell flat. It's still Conservative. It's still strongly Conservative. And I think that there's a kind of demographic and geographic core for them there that ensures they won't get wiped out. But the other thing is they're remarkably chipper about a remarkably terrible set of local election results. It has to be said. Yes, maybe they've bottomed out, but this was the second worst set of local election results for an opposition party ever. The only worst one is the one last year. So they're a long way from recovery still. I think that they have a few points they can point to in terms of causes for optimism, but they need reform to slip up a lot more, and they need to eat into the reform boat a lot more to be recovering. And that is the one other thing I would say. They are the most likely beneficiary if reform do slip up and slide back. Because, again, of our bloc politics, because there's a big chunk of voters who have gone over to reform since the general election, who still say they're open to a Conservative vote, they're potentially positive about Badenoch, they haven't lost their good feeling towards a party they've probably voted for a number of times in the past. So there is a market for them there. And so in a way, the fate of those two parties is tied. If reform start to struggle, it is the Conservatives who are most likely to benefit from that. And if we want to get to that scenario you mentioned, if they want to get to that scenario you mentioned of being credible as a potential party of government again, that's what needs to happen.
I can't think of, and you can tell me if I'm missing one, but any by-election that comes close to the one that's coming up in Makerfield or Breakerfield, as it's now known, for capturing and not just symbolizing, because it's not just symbolic, but seeming to embody the big question of current politics, in the sense that it looks like if Burnham were to win there, one, he would become Prime Minister because Labour MPs would greet him as the Messiah. But two, it seems like he's shown the way to defeat reform. On the other hand, were he to lose there with everything riding on it, and given what's going on with Farage now, it would look like a clear marker that the reform bandwagon is still marching towards Downing Street. And yet, for all of that, I have my doubts. And one of them relates to the point that you made earlier about Burnham's transition, because he will be running there as an opposition candidate. It is presumably a unique by-election in the sense that the pitch is vote for the party of government to change the government. And were he to win, do you think it's possible that Labour MPs might overinterpret what it tells them about their ability to defeat reform? Because next time he stands against reform, it will not be as an oppositional candidate. It will be precisely, as you said, as the thing being opposed. So it's both, it is, I think we'll agree, it's an extraordinary and fascinating prospect, this by-election. But do you think there's a danger that seeing it as a proxy for the fate of the country misses its unique qualities?
Yeah, I do think we're going to find ourselves a little bit in furious agreement here, David, because I think the way you've laid things out is spot on. I mean, I think we should remember it's not like Burnham could pick from a buffet of seats in terms of deciding where to run. But in many respects, for a politician who is pitching themselves as a person with the qualities to break the mold and pull Labour out of its rut, this seat is kind of ideal for making that case. Because his pitch is Labour have crashed in places like Makerfield. I am the person who can turn it around in places like this. So a dominant win in a seat like this makes his case for him straight away. But he also goes into this knowing he has home field advantage in this seat because it sits within the combined authority where he's mayor in the region where he's most popular. So he comes in with an inherent advantage in making that case. And it is going to be, I think, the hinge point of the whole parliament. A reform victory is not impossible. Look at how they did in the local elections last week. And if reform win in this seat, it is a similarly powerful symbolic argument. They have defeated the most popular Labour politician in his home patch. They are now the party that can win these places hand over fist.
And it should be said, if they win, they plunge Labour back into a psychodrama that makes this week's psychodrama look like just a sideshow, I would suggest. If Reform win and therefore Burnham is out of the game, and Labour then has to choose between keeping Starmer or Streeting or Rayner, I think then the party actually would have a breakdown.
Yeah, I think so. I think it would be pure chaos because it would mean Farage has knocked out the most popular Labour politician in the country. And not only does that leave Labour asking themselves who can lead us, but it also leaves Labour Party thinking, can we continue to exist in places like this at all? If someone like Burnham can't win in a place like this, then we're really stuffed. So that would be mass panic, I think, amongst Labour MPs who represent similar seats. But to return to your point, Burnham winning is a necessary condition for Labour renewal and a necessary condition for Labour to turn things around in places like this, I think, given how dire things are with Starmer, but not a sufficient condition. I think you're absolutely right. Things may look very different once again when we get to May 2027. Say what would we be, like 6 months, 9 months into a Burnham premiership at that point? And then he's no longer Andy from Greater Manchester. He's no longer your mayor sticking up for you against hostile London. He is hostile London. He is the government that's letting people down. He is the Labour government that people are impatient with. He's probably more closely tied to the Labour brand at that point. And that will then be the real test case of whether or not this is a leadership change that can turn things around for Labour. Because a lot of these same places, thanks to our peculiar system of electing by thirds in local councils, the exact same places will get to weigh in again, and we'll see whether there's any change in the sentiment. And of course, in the interim also, talking of blockbuster by-elections, we'll get the largest by-election ever in British history if Burnham wins to replace him as Greater Manchester Mayor. And that will be another absolutely critical test. So this is not the end of the story in terms of Labour's efforts to reconnect with these places. It's not even, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, the beginning of the end. It may just be the end of the beginning.
We may return to the state of British politics, or we may not. It all depends on what happens. But before any of that, coming soon on PPF, we have a new set of episodes in our series on great political fictions. I'm going to be starting with a book that I think I often allude to on this podcast, but never really discuss: Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Before that, next time in our regular slot, it's another recording from the Regent Street Cinema in London. I'm going to be talking to the writer and broadcaster Helen about George Clooney's film Good Night and Good Luck, and we are going to be discussing McCarthyism then and now. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.